regular energy media readers will know that I support the oil sands on two conditions. One is that the oil sands industry cleans up its environmental performance, and two, that it lowers its absolute greenhouse gas emissions, not emissions intensity per barrel, but its absolute emissions. And if they do that, then I think it should be supported. Now, Canada West Foundation has done a study and said, okay, well, what have other industries done to grapple with these issues and lessons that can be applied to the oil sands? And to talk about that, I'm going to welcome Marla Orenstein, who's a research director at CWF.
Thank you so much.
Like, give me the nickel tour here, Marla. What's the study about?
Yeah, well, we're all really familiar with the situation that the oil sands is in today, and the gap between the public's trust and where they are. But they're not the only Canadian industry that's ever been in this situation. Forestry's been there. You probably remember the battles over Clayoquot Sound and the War of the Woods. The chemicals industry has been there. If you think back to the Bhopal disaster, that's certainly something that undermined trust. There was a train derailment in Mississauga that resulted in this giant fireball and a cloud of chlorine gas. There was a problem there. Mining has certainly had its share of difficulties. Beef, agriculture, electricity, they've all faced these same public trust issues. And what we did is we looked at what they did as a result. There's a lot of commonalities in the approach that they took to rebuild public trust. And we would argue that they're actually in a fairly different position today than they were in the past because of going down that route. So forestry's not in the same position. Mining's not in the same position. Chemicals not in the same position. Not all problems have disappeared, but they've managed to start building that bridge to restoring public trust. And it's time for the oil sands to do the same.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I've made that argument in a slightly different way, but many times in columns. So I'm on board for this. So give us one concrete example of a lesson that the oil sands could take from another sector and apply it to rebuild public trust.
Sure thing. What I'm going to refer to here is the Mining Association of Canada's Towards Responsible Mining, Towards Sustainable Mining Program, or TSM. And it's something that was enough of a success that it's been taken up in a lot of other countries as well. And how to explain this? We hear a lot about ESG these days. ESG is a real buzzword, environmental, social, and governance. And that's like a basket of metrics that people use to assess the performance of a company at a particular point in time. But the approach taken by the mining industry was much, much broader than that. It didn't start with ESG. It started with a vision, it started with principles, and it started with goals. So instead of saying, how do we measure these emissions, or how do we measure our water use, or how do we measure gender equity? It started by saying, what are the values of the people who are affected by our activities? Where do we share these values? What are the common goals that we can work for? And then all the ESG metrics that they look at, they arose out of this. So that approach, starting with values and what's shared, what are the aspirational goals, and what are the guidelines for performance, that's where you really need to start.
Well, that sounds like an ambitious program, and not one, in my opinion, that's likely to be seized upon by the oil and gas industry leaders of today. I'm a little pessimistic on that front. So where did the leadership come in the mining sector, the forestry sector, the chemical sector? I mean, was there an individual that came forward in each one of those and kind of led the way, or was it a trade association? Where did that come from?
Great question. It was slightly different in each. And when we think about forestry, it was actually the Canadian Council of Forestry Ministers that had a hand in kicking this off. And in the case of mining, there were a lot of ministers that came together in Whitehorse and also provided some of the initial impetus. But in all cases, there were also champions from within industry, people who were really part and parcel of the industry, who stood up and said, this is the way that we really need to go. And also in all cases, the success was really built on the fact that it wasn't just people from industry. They brought in stakeholders. They brought in hostile stakeholders. They brought in neutral stakeholders, because they figured if they don't have those voices at the table, they're going to have them out demonstrating against us. So it had to be a really broad coalition. It also had to be finessed in a way that it wasn't going to scare off everybody in the industry and have them refuse to participate.
That's fascinating, because there's parallels in the oil sands industry. And again, readers will know the story about how in 2014, 5 oil sands CEOs began meeting with 5 environmental group executive directors. And by fall of 2015, they came up with a bunch of initiatives that were enshrined in the climate leadership plan, including the 100 megaton oil sands emissions cap. So, and they did it for exactly the reasons that you say that the other sectors did it, Marla. And that went over like a lead balloon with the rest of the industry. And I think, you know, it's a little case study in how the industry has failed.
I think you're right. The context has changed a little bit. Obviously, we have a different provincial government in power right now. We have some different leaders of some of the major companies, but also the world keeps moving on, and it's continuing to march in the direction of increased accountability. And I think that's what's driven some of the large pledges that have been made by some of these companies in the last few years, some of the net zero pledges that have come out. Yes, they've been criticized by some people for saying, well, you don't have a solid plan for getting there. But I tend to think that the very fact that they've made these pledges really has them plant a flag in the ground and say, this is our ambition, this is where we want to get to. So GHG emissions alone, net zero, is not quite as broad as what we're talking about with these performance management programs, but it's a step in the same direction. And it'll be really interesting to see if this is something that they're more willing to do because of the changes that have happened in the last 5 or 6 years.
Well, I really hope so, and I think that they're even though they have made some steps forward, they've been baby steps in my opinion. And I'll be one of those commentators who will be criticizing from within the tent. Well, a few times they let me in the tent, but I think that that's really important. This is not a case of, as the politicians often frame it, of wanting to shut the oil sands down. It's that many people calling for that. It is better performance, much better performance, and doing things in a different way and preparing for that low carbon future in a more ambitious way than they currently are. So anyway, thank you very much for this, Marla. Really appreciate it. I will look forward to reading the study, and I know we're going to have you on again because we had you on last week. So thank you for
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Markham. Okay, bye-bye.